Hey everybody, Zach here, and today we're going to do the assembly of the Mythos Pedals Boost Kit. Here's the circuit board. I'm going to walk you through this build process, and we're going to have some fun. So if you've never built a pedal before, I will email you a PDF with instructions. In those instructions, I tell you to do the resistors all at once, double check your work, solder those, then move on to diodes, then capacitors, and kind of work in batches. For the video, I'm going to do all the components at once and then solder them just for simplicity's sake. But if you're new to pedal building, move in steps, double check your work, and I promise you, you'll be better for it. So okay, let's start doing the resistors. In your kit, you'll have everything in individually labeled bags, but since I'm a professional pedal builder, I have things in fancy trays. What you want to do is take a resistor, let's see here, and bend the leads like that. Let me show you how that looks. Take the resistor and pinch it on the body. Let's see, focus. There we go. Pinch it on the body and just push the leads down to where they're doing that. You take that part, then you put it into the circuit board. This is 4.7K, so that goes right here. Push it through, flip the board over, take the leads, pinch them, bend them outward, and the resistor will be held in place. All right, I'm going to put all these resistors on. You hang tight. Okay, so there's all the resistors on the circuit board. Now, like I said before, if you've never done this, put all these parts on, double check your work, make sure everything's in there okay, flip these over, then clip the leads. I'm going to go ahead and do that. To show you how that's done. I recommend buying one of these flush cutters. Very handy for cutting resistor leads. Any leads, really. Have them a little junk drawer. And then give it a little length. You don't want to cut them completely flush or they'd fall out. Give them a clip like that. Now, why do you do that? Because now it's easier to handle it. And if you've never done this before, it's easier to solder it without all those pesky leads in the way. It's much easier to get in here. So, we're going to move on though. Next, I'll do the diode. Now, in the instructions, I want you to read the instructions carefully, but I explain how the orientation of these things work. Some of the components are polarized. Now, you see how that D1, that's the diode, has a little white stripe, and see how this diode has a silver stripe on the left-hand side? Those need to match. So you bend the leads just like you did on the resistor, and you put it in with that stripe matching the silk screen. See? Push it through. And there you go. Same thing. Bend the leads out. Perfect. Go ahead and clip these leads off. There you go. The diode is done. Really simple. Next, we're going to do the capacitors. Now, there's only a few in this kit, so it's really easy. I'm going to go ahead and do that. All right. Now, we're going to put in a capacitor. Now, these red capacitors are not polarized. That means they can go either way. And printed on the cap, that second line is the value, 0.047, 0.047. So that's C1. For this cap, all you have to do is take it and stick it onto the PCB through the leads. Hold it like this, tilt it over, bend those leads just like you did on the resistor and stay in place. Let's do the rest. C2 and C3 are 0.1 UF, and they're exactly the same process. Okay. C4 is a little different. C4 is what's called an electrolytic capacitor. And it's gold and looks like that. Now, electrolytic capacitors are polarized. Now, what does that mean? That means that it has a positive and a negative side. Now, you see how that side on the right has a longer leg lead than the one on the left? That's the positive side. And that will be indicated on the circuit board. And also the negative side has a black stripe typically, and you can see it has a negative symbol. Pretty straightforward. But when you put this on the PCB, what you want to do is take the long leg and match it up with the side that has the little positive symbol and the square pad. Put that side in, and put in the negative side. This one will kind of click in. There you go. And then you want to bend the leads out just like you did on the resistor. And that's it. Seated firmly. Now that's all the caps, and let's go ahead and just clip these leads. And again, when you're clipping leads, try to put them in some sort of container. There we go. So that's everything but the transistor. So let's get that. Next, we're going to do the transistor. It's a little three-legged component. Now, when you flip it up on its side and you look at it from the top, you'll see it's kind of D-shaped. And you want that shape to correspond with what's on the circuit board. And you just match the legs and the shape, put it in that way. Pretty simple. So on the circuit board, you can see there's a flat side on the top and a round side on the bottom. So you want to take the transistor and match that. And just get the three legs to go in the holes and correspond with the shape. It's hard to do this with the camera in the way. You see how that's matched up? Do that and then give it a push. That's plenty. Then you're going to take these little leads, bend them outwards, and there you go. All the main components are on the board. Let's get this soldered. Okay, so I've got the PCB in this little holder. That's just going to make making this video a lot easier. But bear with me. I've never soldered with a camera in front of my face. So in the instructions, you will see that I included lead-free solder. Now, this is what I like to use because I ship pedals all over the world, so I like to be ROHS compliant, not have any lead. And I'm pretty comfortable using it. And the lead-free solder that I included, I think, is one of the easiest to solder types that I've found so far. But if you're uncomfortable or haven't soldered a lot, I recommend grabbing some leaded solder, some 6040 leaded solder. And there's a link in the description below, and you can find some if you'd like to do that. It's a lot easier, but just for safety's sake, I like to do everything ROHS. So I've got my solder station, my Hako, tuned up to 720 degrees, and let's get soldering. So if you haven't soldered, I recommend practicing on something if you have a broken pedal or something you can try, but I assume if you're going to make a kit that you've soldered something before. So I've got my chisel tip here, my small chisel tip. We're just going to try soldering these things with the camera in our face. Here we go. All right. There we go. So you just want to go through, hit all those solder, those pads, and make a nice clean solder joint. I'm going to go ahead and do that. There you go. I've honestly not soldered many circuit boards that far away from my face. but let's see how they look. Looks okay. I'm going to trim all these leads and inspect these solder joints. Let's trim these leads. Again, you just have to trim them to the top of the solder joint. You don't have to trim them completely flush. Okay, get all those little clipped leads off of there. You don't want anything shorting anything out. There's one. All right. So I can already see a couple things that might be an issue because I'm soldering so far away, it's hard to see. These two right here look like they could bridge. Let me check. No, they're not touching, but they very well could. So what I usually like to do in that sort of situation is just reflow the solder, then inspect it. That's better. Let me clip those. Let's make sure we're not running the risk of shorting anything out. Okay. Let me hold these up to my eyes, see what I think. Not my best work. Let's flow some of these again. See if we can get a better solder joint. Again, soldering with a camera in your face is not easy. I'm just going to reflow all of these, touching it very quickly with the iron to make sure there's no cold solder joints. And I'm literally just melting the solder very quickly. Let me see. That looks better. Okay. Let's install that potentiometer. Now we're going to solder in the potentiometer. Now the potentiometer you have should be 100 Ka. I'll say right there. And how this goes into the circuit board is pretty straightforward. On the board itself, you'll see there's a square pad, and there's a little tiny 1 above that. And that corresponds with the first leg of this pot. Now that means you got to turn the pot over, and that's 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. Put the pot and their little leads through the PCB. Go ahead and push them flush. And there's a couple different ways to go about soldering this. Sometimes you can solder from the back just to make sure the pot doesn't go anywhere, and then flip it over and solder the leads on the other side. I think I'm going to do that just because it may be easier with a camera in my face. So let's see. Flow in the solder and let it rest and sit flush. There we go. Seated nice and flush. I usually solder the middle lug. And now that's not going anywhere. I'll stand up. You can flow in the solder on the first and third lug, and then hit that second lug with a little bit more solder, just for good measure. And it should look something like that. Now, if you don't like all that flux, see all that shiny stuff on the circuit board? It's back here too. See all that stuff? If you really don't like that, you can take a toothbrush and some isopropyl alcohol and brush it off. But it's not going to hurt anything, so I just usually ignore it. Moving on. Next step, we are going to talk about cutting the leads for your PCB. Now, I opened up an enclosure. So we have this, it's kind of a guide so we can figure out how long we need to cut our wire. In each kit, you have about 3 feet of wire, which should be enough to wire this thing up. So fingers crossed. I recommend getting some sort of wire cutter, wire stripper thing. Link in the description below. But yeah, so I'm gonna uncoil some wire here. There we go. Take your enclosure, flip it over, and then take the circuit board, and you don't have to mount the pot to the enclosure just yet. We're just going to use this as basically a guide to figure out how long we need to make the wires that go from the bottom of the PCB to the foot switch, the ground pad right here that goes to the input jack, and then the 2 connections right here that go to the power jack. Now usually when I'm doing this, I'll take the wire and I'll measure well past the edge of the enclosure. So let's just say, it's going to be from here. How I usually like to route the wire is down and then along the inside face of the enclosure, then up the edge of the switch. So it kind of makes a U shape. So it's going from underneath the board and then up to the foot switch. You see? So let's see. If we go from here to, let's say, about here, that should be plenty of, wire. How long is this? That is about 2.5, 2 3/4 of an inch. So let's cut, let's see. And that should be plenty for this connection too. Actually, that's probably too much. But let's go ahead and cut 3 more for the bottom of the PCB. Okay, and there's still a couple feet of wire left. It's not rocket science, so don't stress too much about it. Get the enclosure out of the way. Get your solder ready. Let's go ahead and strip these wires a little bit and get them ready to put through the circuit board. So you only need to strip off a small amount of wire. So if that'll focus. That's just a very small amount of wire to go through the circuit board itself. So that's looking like about 1/8 of an inch. So you want to do that. Then you'll take the board, put the wire from the bottom, and you'll have a tiny little bit poking through. Let's go ahead and do that for the rest of these pieces of wire. Okay, now we have all our wire stripped. What I usually will do is I'll take the circuit board and I will put all the wires in like this, stand them up, gather them together, and then flip it over. And they'll kind of stay seated like that, right? And you can see they're just hanging out right there. So I'll use my finger to kind of steady it. It's kind of hard to have this camera and everything. Just solder these on. There we go. Doing everything with a camera and microphone in your way is not easy. There we go. So those are seated nicely. They're looking flush on the bottom side. Let's go ahead and trim all this excess off. You don't want to trim it flush. You just want to clip off any little amount of extra that's hanging out. And always give this stuff a visual inspection. That looks good. All the connections are there. Nothing shorting out. Looks nice. One of these is much longer than the rest. Let's go ahead and put it back in the enclosure. Oh yeah, that's going to be plenty of lead to go down into the foot switch, because we're only going to the first 2 rows of the foot switch. Let's do the same thing for the DC jack and this little ground pad here. So since we have plenty of wire, there's a lot left. Let's cut 2 random lengths. Let's say just like 2 inches should be plenty for the DC jack, a little over 2 inches. And let's do the same for the ground wire. And then all you have left is you'll need 2 more pieces of wire to do the in and out connections. And that's it. And you should have well over a foot. Let's do the same thing. Let's strip these. Just about 1/8 of an inch. Don't need much. All right. There we go. We'll take these 2 longer pieces. We'll do the same thing for the DC jack, which is in the top corner here. This is going to go to the top of the enclosure for the power. Flip it over. Put those 2 wires through the pads there. Well, sometimes they fall out. You just got to put them in and kind of hope for the best. Sometimes I'll straighten them so they kind of sit a little better. All right. Take your solder. This is a little easier because I can hold those wires. Flow in the solder on those pads. Voila. DC jack is soldered. Clip off the excess. Again, don't go too short. Just clip off any little amount of extra that's hanging out up there. And you can see nice flush connection on the bottom. Not super flush. There's a little exposed wire, but that's fine. And if let's see if we can catch this in the light here. You can kind of see there's a little bit of wire exposed. If this bothers you, when you strip the rest of it, you can push this insulation down to sit flush. But so long as nothing's shorting out between those 2 connections, you're fine. And lastly, let's do this ground wire, which is right here in the corner. And this will go to the ground connection on the input jack. The output jack doesn't need a ground connection because I've included lock washers, which will ground the jacks together through the enclosure itself. All right, this one's giving me fits. Here we go. Let's hold it. Flow that solder in. Try not to blow on the joint to cool it. I'm just trying to blow the smoke out of my face. There you go. And that's all the wired connections you have. Now these connections on the PCB down here, this is the input. The first wire is the input. The second wire is the LED connection. The third wire is the ground for the foot switch. The fourth wire is the out for the circuit. This again is your ground for your input jack. On the left here is the positive connection for your DC jack. And on the right is the ground connection for your DC jack. And that's it. Moving right along. Okay guys, so next we're gonna do the foot switch. So pretty straightforward. In your kit, you will have a little 0 ohm resistor. This is basically a jumper. Nothing special, nothing crazy. I just think it looks nicer than a piece of wire. Now in the link in the description below, you'll see one of these things. This is just a lead bender. And usually if you put a component between the 4 and the 5 on this side, the 4.5 here, it will perfectly line up with these outside lugs. Because what we're going to do is create a jumper from the 3rd lug of row A to the 3rd lug of row C. A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. Easy. So let's do that. So if you have one of these things, take the component, put it right in there, hold it with your fingers, thumb and then pinch it over, and you're going to get a perfectly spaced component. Try to straighten up the legs a little bit. There you go. Now what I like to do is slide the resistor through all the little lugs right there, where it sits almost flush with the edge of the switch body. So you can see, it's kind of hard to see right there. We go. See how it's sitting flush? All right. Looking pretty good. Now you want to solder that. You just want to flow enough solder to where it fills up the little open space on the lug itself. And I'm using the enclosure of the pedal. It's kind of like a stand for the foot switch. There we go. And that's it. Now, take your flush cutters and clip these little leads. Now we're going to save one. The other one we can toss. Take one that's relatively straight, and we're going to take it from the first lug of row A. Let me turn it around. First lug of row A, and run it to the third lug of row B. And what that's going to do is ground the input of the boost to ground when the effect is bypassed, making sure there's no extra noise or whatnot. So all you got to do is take this little lead wire and slide it in and set it in that last lug and first lug, and it'll set pretty much like that. Now there's a diagram in the instructions that will show you what this is supposed to look like. So that will help clarify anything if you want to see it in a, drawn format. Now you need to solder the third lug on row B, but leave this other connection just open for now. So solder that. There you go. And then on this excess lead right here, just want to take it and clip a little bit off. You can leave a little hanging out of the switch, but that's that. Now let's start throwing stuff in the enclosure. Okay guys, next we're going to install the LED and the PCB into our enclosure. Easy. Now your LED is polarized. That means it has a negative and positive side. So see how this leg is longer than that leg? The longer leg is the positive side. And what that means is it's going to go in the square hole on the PCB, which is on the left here. You can see that pad is square. And you'll really be able to see that on your PCB. But what you need to do is flip it over, and from the bottom, put that long leg in the square pad, square hole, and just let it slide in and sit there. Now, let that hang out. Get your enclosure, flip it over. What we're going to do is put the pot in. Try to line up the LED with the hole that is in the face of the enclosure. Push your pot in. Now you have a nut and a washer for your potentiometer. You flip it over. Tighten that on. You don't have to use any sort of driver or anything yet. You just need to have it sitting securely on the face of the pedal. Now flip everything back over. Make sure your circuit board is fairly square inside the enclosure. And see if I can move the light here so you can see that. See, the LED is now, it's not seated in the hole. You just kind of have to angle it and push it in right there. And what I usually like to do is just kind of bend the leads a little bit so it sits where it needs to sit. Now if you let the enclosure rest on the post of the potentiometer, it's going to keep that LED up and not push it out, so it'll keep it in place. Take your soldering iron and some of your solder and solder it in place. There you go. Clip the leads. And your LED is ready to go. Okay, next we're going to solder up the foot switch to our PCB and install it in the enclosure. So what you need to do, take off the top nut and these two washers. Put this lock washer back on the foot switch. For whatever reason, I don't like it when people put those on the outside. I don't think it looks right, and it kind of drives me crazy. You want to make sure that the little resistor you installed is facing the back of the enclosure. So put it in thusly. Flip it over, put that white washer and the nut on, and just tighten it with your fingers. It doesn't have to be super tight. Just kind of want to keep it, it's going to sit in place. There you go. Now, bend this ground wire out of the way, and we need to route the wires from the PCB to the foot switch, and they're in order as to how I think they should be installed. Well, I mean, it's how they should be installed, not how I think. It's how it needs to go. So what I like to do is push the wires where they kind of make a U shape. See that? Now that is going to easily let you strip the wire back and solder the connection. So the first wire goes to the first lug on row A, right here. That's your in connection for the circuit. Now, since you have a little excess wire here, I'm just going to clip some of that excess off. Take my wire strippers and kind of, just see kind of how much you think you need to take off. Always take off less than you think you need. You can always take off more later. So let's see, just take off about 1/8 of an inch. And then put that wire in the lug, and then try to have it seated in there, and then push the wire where it needs to go. So it doesn't have to be seated perfectly flush, but now you can kind of see that is looking really nice, seated right there, as it should be. Now you can go ahead and solder that connection. And what you want to do is, again, fill up that entire lug with solder. Don't go crazy. You don't want to solder too long. You will melt that part of the plastic on the foot switch if you're too crazy. Sorry, my hand was in the way. This next one should be a little clearer. But you want to make sure that you have a really nice connection on that lug. Then nothing's going to pull out or not be connected. So there we go. That's the first connection. The next connection. This is your LED wire. This connects the LED to ground and turns it on when the pedal comes on. So again, do the same thing. And that's going to go to the first lug on row B right here. Looks like this wire is trimmed exactly where it needs to be. So we'll just cut off about 1/8 inch of insulation. Put that there. You want to try to have everything look as pretty as possible. It goes a long way. You can kind of just push it down. And if you want to, you can actually grab that end of the wire and kind of flip it up, and it'll help it kind of stay in place. So there we go. There's that. Sorry. This workbench and trying to film this is not the easiest thing in the world. Okay. There's that. Now let's go ahead and solder that connection. Again, just a few seconds. And since there's a little excess on that, you can clip that off. And yeah, you can actually do that on the first one. Just want to make sure you don't clip that jumper connection. So there's a little bit of excess wire. Snip it off. With these flush cutters, it's really easy to get in and make a really nice looking connection. Looks super pro. Okay, the next connection is ground, and that goes to the middle lug. So lug 2, row B, right there in the middle of the foot switch. So that wire is pretty much exactly where it needs to be again. Sorry if my hands are in the way. So I'm just going to strip just a little bit off. Again, about 1/8 of an inch, a couple millimeters. And you want to route that wire like so. Just to where it's not going to short anything out, but it's seated perfectly in there. All right, put that there. Now let's solder that connection. Let's see, I'm trying to do this. There we go. Where it's going to be easy for you guys to see what I'm doing. All right. So solder that, make sure it flows well. Check your work. Don't breathe the smoke. And then usually what I like to do is after it cools for a second, you can kind of bend it and make that connection look, make that wire routing look really nice. There you go. So see how everything's kind of running flush along the bottom of the enclosure. It's not perfect, but there you go. Looks pretty good. And then this last wire is your out for the circuit board. So you're going to do the same thing that we did previously. Bend it, strip it, solder it. Okay, again, you just put that wire in that lug. Want to make it look nice, kind of push it down where everything's kind of evenly distributed best you can. It's not going to be absolutely perfect, but tidy wiring, I think it's easier to diagnose problems if everything looks clean to begin with. All right, and now solder that one up. You might have noticed that I switched to a larger chisel tip. It's a little bit easier when soldering large connections. All right, everything looks pretty good. Clip off that excess right there. And might as well clip off a little bit of that excess on the ground. Again, be sure not to clip that jumper wire in there. But that's it. That is the foot switch connection coming from the PCB. And next, we'll move on to some of this other wiring. Okay guys, next we're going to install our DC jack, this little plastic guy right here where the power comes in. But the pot's in the way. So I have a little nut driver here. Just loosen that pot. Poke it through like that, and now it's going to be free because it's soldered. Take this DC jack. Slide it through, take the nut for the DC jack, and thread it on, and then reinstall the potentiometer and the LED. Now it should just all slide perfectly back in place. So flip it back over, put on the nut and the washer. And now's a good time if you have some sort of driver to tighten that. What I like to do is hold it from the back, make sure it's kind of square, flip it over, give it a tighten, and now it's looking pretty good in there. All right, so now we have the DC jack installed. You want to have it where it's looking like that. Little ground connections on the left. You'll see a diagram in the instructions, but just tighten it with your fingers. You don't have to go crazy tightening it with any tools just yet. Next, let's do the in and out jack. So you have 2 jacks in your kit. Go ahead and remove the nut and the washer on both the in and out jack. They're the same, they're both mono. No reason to do a stereo in because there's no battery. Slide on the lock washer like so. Then take the jack, put it in, and on the input jack where you have this ground wire, you want that ground wire to go looped under the input jack. So it'll look nice and pretty. So put that on and install the washer, the nut. Just tighten it with your fingers, should be fine. And then do the same thing on the other side. Lock washer, put it in, hold it with your finger, and then put on the washer and the nut. There we go. Now we're starting to look like something. Okay, so that is installing the hardware. Next, we'll do the soldering of the DC jack, then the in and out jacks. Okay guys, next we're going to be doing the soldering of the DC jack. Now this is fairly straightforward. There's only two connections you have to do. You have the ground and the hot. Now on the PCB, you'll see you have two little wires. On the left, the pad is square, and on the right, the pad is a circle. Now, the rightmost wire is your ground wire, and the leftmost is your hot. This is your 9-volt in. This is your power. So let's go ahead and do the ground wire. Now to make this route nice and pretty, you just kind of push it to where you think it should look, and then you're going to strip off a little excess wire. So get your wire strippers. This one I'm going to strip off more than I've done in the past. Not that much. Pull that off. And not that much. Now go ahead and route that to your ground connection. Your ground connection is a little angled piece on the side of the DC jack, and you'll see that in the diagram in the instructions. Run that wire through, and then push it to where it kind of just curls along the side of the enclosure. You can bend it, and that kind of locks it in place. Make it look pretty. There you go. Now you want to solder that. You can be fairly generous with the solder. It's not going to hurt anything. There you go. And then take your wire cutters, clip off the excess, and your ground connection is done. We're going to do the same thing for the power. Kind of route it to match the ground wire. Mirror that. And we're going to strip off some excess wire. That may be too much, but we'll see. Let's see, so that should be fine. Now you want to route it down and through that top connection. Avoid that other little lug. Bend it up, and it should look something like that. Now we're going to solder that connection. And again, you can be fairly generous with the solder on this. Make sure it flows into the wire, makes a really strong connection. And again, just want to clip off the excess. And if the lead falls into the enclosure like it did just there, shake it out, get rid of it. There you go. So the DC jack is now soldered and looking really nice. Next, let's do those in and out jacks. Just a few more things to solder. We're just going to solder the in and out jacks of the pedal, and then we're ready to test it. So remember that little ground wire that's looping around underneath the jack? It's coming from the circuit board here. That is going to go to this lug. Now this is the sleeve lug, so you imagine your cable comes in like that, and it's touching this inner ring, and that's connecting the ground. And so that is your ground sleeve connection. So you just take this wire, you can kind of pull it where you need to, and strip off a little of the insulation. It's a little tricky down in there, but I trust you. You can pull it out from underneath the bottom of the jack if you need to. Just give it a little strip. There you go. Boom. And then you're going to take that wire and route it through that lug on the input jack. See, it's just sitting real pretty underneath there, looking really nice. You can kind of move it, make sure there's a little slack, and that's fine. We're going to take our solder and solder that connection up. And again, just like on the DC jack, you can be rather generous with the solder on this. There we go. You want to make sure that connection's strong. And that looks pretty nice. Let's clip the excess wire off. And that connection is good. Good to go. All right, now we're going to add some wires. Okay, we're in the home stretch now. All we have to do is add wires from the second lug of row A to the input, the hot connection on the input jack, and do the same thing, second lug on row C to the hot connection on the output jack. And then we're done. We just have to tighten everything up and make sure it works. So you should still have plenty of wire left. If you don't, you just have to get some, I'm sorry. But you want to kind of approximate how much wire you need. See, that looks like more than plenty. Take that, clip off that piece. Over here, you're just going from this lug to this terminal on the jack, really close, but you want to give it a little extra, so let's do like that much. Clip that. Now go ahead and strip off about 1/8 of an inch off the wire. Yeah. So let's see, let me strip that. We'll do the same on this other piece of wire. It's a little more than 1/8 of an inch, but that's okay. Now we're going to put it in the foot switch on, again, second lug on row A. We're going to solder that in. Make a really good connection. This is where your signal flows into the circuit. There you go. Take your wire cutters and trim the excess. Make it look pretty. There we go. A little piece fell down. Don't want little trimmings to be hanging around inside that enclosure for sure. Do the same thing on the output jack side. I tend to put the wire in and then kind of give it a bend, and that tends to hold it in place while I'm soldering. It makes it look pretty nice. So take that, hit it with some solder, give it a nice strong connection. Again, clip off the excess wire right there so it looks nice. And there we go. So you have the two wires kind of hanging out there. Go ahead and do the input wire first. So we're going to take that, loop it around. Again, there's plenty extra here. And so might as well trim off a little of that excess so it's easier to strip. Okay. Now take your wire strippers and you want to trim off to about the start of that terminal. And that's going to give you enough lead to make a good solid connection. It's better to have too much than not enough. Again, we just strip that off. There's about 1 inch that I'm stripping off here. Pull that off. And then put it through that lug there. Try to bend it and make it look fairly nice. I want to bend this little wire up and make sure that it's kind of sitting flush and looking pretty on that connection. And then I want to hit that with some solder. Kind of just flow it onto that connection on that little terminal there, that little lug, whatever you want to call it. Make sure there's enough to make a really even coating of solder, a really strong connection, clip off the excess, and your input connection is done and looking real nice. Look at that. Boom. You kind of want to flow solder on both sides. So what I usually do is heat up the bottom and flow solder onto it, and it kind of just takes it everywhere it needs to go. We're going to do the same thing on the output jack. Again, it's just going from there to there. This is pretty close, so what I usually do is try to give a little extra. I'll just clip off about that much. There's quite a bit of excess wire, but that's okay. Again, you should have plenty. Route it through the hole. Give it a little bit of a push. You can grab it from this side, kind of pull it. You want to push it where it's all as flat as you can get it on that little terminal there. And again, flow the solder. I usually hold the wire and heat up the whole thing from the back, flow a little solder on the back, and then flow solder on the top. Sorry, my finger's in the way. So holding it flowing it from the back, hit some from the back, and then flow solder on the top. You're gonna have a really strong, even connection. Don't breathe that smoke. Trim off the excess. And there you go. All your connections are done. Let's see if that LED lights up. Okay, and the last step we're going to do in this video, see if this thing turns on. Have my power here. Plug it into the DC jack, and then there's that LED. Hit the foot switch. Hey! She lights up. Put that knob on, and you're ready to go. See if your boost pedal works. I hope it does. If it doesn't, send me an email. We'll troubleshoot it, get it taken care of. Thanks for watching, guys. See you soon.